They said there'd be someone holding a sign, but the only thing holding her was the wind. The train wheezed to a stop at Dust Hollow Station, Wyoming territory, releasing a cloud of black smoke that mingled with the February cold. Rachel Eleanor Vance gripped the worn handle of her trunk and stepped down onto the wooden platform, her boots landing with a solid thud that seemed to echo in the sparse afternoon air. At 34, she stood 6 feet tall in her traveling boots, a height that had long ceased to surprise her but never failed to surprise others. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a practical brown bonnet, and her wool coat, though mended in places only a seamstress would notice, hung well on her frame. She'd sewn it herself 3 winters ago in Cedar Rapids, back when she still had a shop and regular customers who didn't stare quite so much. The platform was nearly empty. A few men lounged against the depot wall, passing a flask between them despite the early hour. Their conversation died as she emerged from the train car, their eyes tracking upward, always upward, to take in the full measure of her height. Rachel straightened her shoulders, a habit born of years of being told to slouch, to shrink, to take up less space in the world. She scanned the platform for Thomas Reddick, the widower who'd placed the advertisement in the Iowa newspaper. His letters had been brief but proper, describing himself as a respectable rancher seeking a mature, kind-hearted woman for companionship and marriage. He'd promised someone would meet her at the station. The wind cut through her coat, carrying the scent of snow and livestock. Dust Hollow spread before her like a rough sketch, a main street of packed dirt, wooden buildings leaning slightly as if gossiping with their neighbors. And beyond that, the endless Wyoming sky pressing down like a gray wool blanket. "That her?" she heard one of the men mutter. "Lord Almighty," came the response. "That's a lot of woman." Rachel kept her expression neutral, a skill perfected through years of similar comments. She lifted her trunk no easy feat after 2 days of travel and began walking toward what appeared to be the station office. Perhaps Thomas had left word inside. The station master, a thin man with pomaded hair, looked up from his ledger as she entered. His eyes widened, traveled up, then settled somewhere around her collar. "Afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Mr. Thomas Reddick. He was meant to meet the afternoon train from Cedar Rapids." The man's eyebrows lifted. "You're the bride from Iowa." The word bride sat heavy in the air between them. Rachel had never been anyone's bride, had long ago accepted she likely never would be, until Thomas's advertisement had offered a different possibility, a mature man seeking a mature woman, someone who valued good sense over pretty faces. "I've corresponded with Mr. Reddick. Yes, do you know where I might find him?" The station master glanced toward the window. "He was here earlier, saw him pacing around, checking his pocket watch every few minutes. But that was..." He consulted the clock on the wall. "Near about an hour ago." An hour. Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the Wyoming winter. "Perhaps he's been delayed," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Perhaps," the station master agreed, though his tone suggested otherwise. He returned to his ledger, effectively dismissing her. Rachel emerged back onto the platform. The men with the flask had multiplied, or perhaps she simply noticed more of them now. They lined the depot wall like crows on a fence, watching her with the casual interest of those who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon. She set down her trunk and stood beside it, hands clasped, waiting. The wind tugged at her bonnet strings. Minutes crawled by like hours. The train, having discharged its few passengers and taken on water, chugged away eastward, leaving her on the platform with her trunk and her fading hopes. "Excuse me," she called to the nearest man. "I'm looking for Mr. Thomas Reddick. Do you know him?" The man grizzled, probably 40, with tobacco stains on his beard straightened from his slouch. "Tommy Reddick, sure. Everyone knows Tommy." He exchanged glances with his companions. "He's got that spread about 5 miles north, raises horses, good ones too." Has he been in town today?" Another exchange of glances, these accompanied by what might have been smirks. "Oh, he was here all right. Saw him myself not 2 hours past, all cleaned up, hair slicked back neat as you please. Even had flowers." The man paused, savoring the moment. "Course, he left in quite a hurry. Didn't look too happy neither." Rachel's hands tightened on each other. "Did he say anything? Leave any message?" "Not with us, ma'am." The man's grin widened. "But then, Tommy always was particular about his women. Likes them small and delicate-like. His Mary, that was his wife who passed Y. She was no bigger than a child. Tiny little thing." The words landed like physical blows, each one carefully aimed. Rachel had weathered such comments before, but somehow here, standing on this strange platform in this strange town with her trunk at her feet, they cut deeper than usual. "Thank you," she said quietly, and turned away before they could see how their words had found their mark. She picked up her trunk and began walking toward the main street. Behind her, she heard the laughter start low at first, then building. She didn't turn around. The main street of Dust Hollow was a study in brown and gray. Brown buildings, brown mud, gray sky. A few women in calico dresses hurried past, clutching baskets and children, their eyes sliding over Rachel with the quick assessment of those who had already heard the gossip. News traveled fast in small towns. By now, half of Dust Hollow probably knew about the too-tall bride from Iowa whose intended had taken one look and fled. Rachel stopped in front of what appeared to be a boarding house. A painted sign swung in the wind. Clean beds, hot meals, no spitting. She needed somewhere to stay the night. Time to think, to plan. Her savings would stretch to a week, perhaps 2 if she was careful. After that, she pushed open the door. A woman emerged from behind a curtained doorway, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that took in Rachel's height, her trunk, her traveling clothes, and came to swift conclusions. $2 a night, paid in advance. No visitors after 9. No liquor in the rooms. No— She paused, her assessment complete. "You're the woman from Iowa, the one Tommy Reddick was supposed to meet." It wasn't a question. Rachel nodded anyway. The woman's expression didn't soften. Exactly. But something in it shifted. "Man's a fool," she said briskly. "Always was, always will be. Still hung up on his Mary. If you ask me, no living woman could measure up to a dead one." She paused. "Though I suppose, in your case, it's more about measuring down." Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Do you have a room available?" "I do, but I'll be honest with you. Miss, what's your name?" "Rachel Vance." "Miss Vance, this town isn't kind to women who don't fit the mold. You're welcome to stay here tonight, but come morning, you might want to think about catching that eastbound train. Go back to Iowa where you came from. Nothing for you here but hard looks and harder words." Rachel set down her trunk with a thud that rattled the floorboards. She was tired, bone-tired of being told where she didn't belong. "I'll take the room," she said, "just for tonight." But even as she said it, even as she followed the woman up the narrow stairs to a small, clean room with a view of the stable yard, Rachel knew she was lying. She'd spent good money on that train ticket, severed her few ties in Cedar Rapids, packed everything she owned into one trunk. She couldn't go back, wouldn't go back just because one man had looked at her and found her wanting. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and unpinned her bonnet, letting her auburn hair fall around her shoulders. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices, footsteps, life continuing around her as if she wasn't there, as if she was invisible despite her height. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The landlady stood in the doorway with a tray bearing a pot of tea and a thick slice of bread with butter. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Train food isn't fit for dogs." "Thank you, that's very kind." The woman lingered, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, she said, "My name's Mrs. Hooper. I run this place alone since my husband died 3 years back. I know what it's like to be a woman on her own in a town like this." She paused. "But I also know there's different kinds of alone. Some you can fix with hard work and stubborn pride. Others," she glanced meaningfully at Rachel, "others are written into your very bones." After Mrs. Hooper left, Rachel poured herself tea and stared out the window at the stable yard below. A man was leading a horse through the mud, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. The horse, a beautiful bay mare, tossed her head and danced sideways, but the man remained patient, steady, until the animal calmed. Rachel watched them until the fading light made it impossible to see, thinking about Thomas Reddick and his flowers, about the men at the station and their knowing laughter, about Mrs. Hooper's blunt kindness. She thought about the shop she'd closed in Cedar Rapids, the life she'd packed into a trunk, the hope she'd carried across 3 states only to have it wither at first sight. The wind rattled the windows, promising snow before morning. Somewhere in this town. Thomas Reddick was probably sitting by his fire, relieved at his narrow escape from the too-tall bride. And here she sat, neither bride nor welcome, with $2 less in her purse and nowhere to go but back to a life that no longer existed. Rachel Vance finished her tea, cold now, and prepared for a long night of staring at the ceiling, wondering what became of women who didn't fit the mold in towns that had no room for them. Tomorrow, she would have to decide the eastbound train, or what possible alternative could there be for a woman like her in a place like this? The wind had no answer, only more cold. The morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow, just as the wind had promised. Rachel rose before dawn, her body stiff from a night spent on the thin mattress, her mind no clearer than it had been the evening before. She dressed carefully in her second-best dress, brown wool, practical, well-made, and pinned her hair with the same careful precision she'd once used on delicate seams. Mrs. Hooper had breakfast laid out in the dining room: biscuits, gravy, fried eggs, and coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. 3 other boarders sat at the long table, all men, all suddenly very interested in their plates when Rachel entered. She took a seat at the far end, her back straight, and ate in silence. The food was good, filling, but it might as well have been sawdust for all she tasted it. Her mind kept circling back to the same question: what now? She was finishing her coffee when she heard a voice from the front parlor, deep and measured, asking for Mrs. Hooper. Rachel recognized something in its tone, a nervous formality that made her stomach tighten. "She's in the kitchen," Mrs. Hooper was saying. "But if you're looking for Miss Vance, she's taking breakfast." Footsteps approached the dining room. Rachel set down her cup and turned. Thomas Reddick stood in the doorway. He was exactly as he'd described himself in his letters: medium height, neat brown beard streaked with gray, hands that showed honest work. He held his hat in those hands now, turning it round and round like a wheel. His eyes blue, she noted, though he'd never mentioned that, found hers and immediately dropped to somewhere around the table's edge. "Miss Vance." His voice cracked slightly on her name. That is, might I have a word?" The other boarders had given up all pretense of eating. Rachel could feel their attention like heat on her skin. She rose slowly, deliberately, every inch of her 6 feet, and followed Thomas into the front parlor. They stood facing each other across a small rose-patterned rug, the morning light through lace curtains casting patterns on the floor between them. Thomas raised his eyes to her face, then dropped them again, then forced them back up. The effort was visible. "I owe you an apology," he began. "You owe me more than that," Rachel said quietly. "You owe me an explanation." He flinched, but nodded. Yes, I do." He took a breath that seemed to come from his boots. "I didn't expect you to be so tall." The words hung in the air between them like icicles. Rachel had known, of course, had known from the moment she'd seen his face at the station yesterday. seen him see her and turn away, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. I mentioned my height in my third letter. She said, 6 feet. You said it didn't matter. I know. His hand strangled his hat brim. Women sometimes exaggerate, say they're taller than they are to sound more, I don't know, imposing. I thought you meant maybe 5'8", 5'9" at most. So you thought I was lying? No, not lying, just, he struggled for words. My Mary was 5'2". When she stood beside me, she had to tip her head back to see my face. When we danced, she fit right under my chin. When we walked through town, people smiled to see us. We looked right together. Rachel felt something cold and sharp lodge in her throat. And we would look wrong? Thomas's silence was answer enough. I see. She moved to the window, needing distance, needing air. Outside. Dust Hollow was waking up. A few women swept their front steps, sending little clouds of snow into the street. A wagon rolled past, wheels crunching, normal life, normal people, normal heights. You're a fine woman, Thomas said behind her. Any man would be lucky. Stop. She turned back to face him. Please don't. I've heard all the consolations. You're a handsome woman, for your height. Some men like tall women. You'll find someone who doesn't mind. I've heard them all. Mr. Reddick. And they're all lies dressed up as kindness. He shifted uncomfortably. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? Rachel crossed her arms. Tell me honestly, if I were 5'2" like your Mary, would we be having this conversation? No, he admitted after a pause. We'd likely be at the courthouse by now. The honesty of it was almost refreshing. At least he wasn't pretending her height didn't matter when clearly it was all that mattered. I brought you all the way from Iowa, he continued miserably. Left you standing at the station. The whole town's talking about it, about how I... He swallowed. How I ran away like a spooked colt. They are. Oh yes, Mrs. Patterson saw the whole thing from the mercantile window. By supper time, everyone knew. They're calling me Tommy the Coward this morning. A bitter smile crossed his face. Though I suspect they're calling you worse. Rachel thought of the men at the station, their knowing laughter. Yes, she could imagine what they were calling her. I want to make it right. Thomas said suddenly, the train ticket, your expenses, I'll pay for your trip back to Iowa. It's the least I can do. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? It was a fair question. What did she want? She'd wanted a husband, a home, a place to belong. She'd wanted what his advertisement had promised, companionship with a mature, sensible man who valued character over appearance. She'd wanted to believe that at 34. Having been passed over so many times, she'd stopped counting. She might finally have found someone who could see past her height to the woman beneath. I want you to look at me, she said finally. Really look at me. Not at how tall I am or how we'd appear walking down the street. Look at me. Thomas lifted his eyes. For a moment, they stood there, truly seeing each other perhaps for the first time. Rachel saw a man imprisoned by other people's opinions, so concerned with appearances that he'd thrown away a chance at happiness because of a few inches. And in his eyes, she saw herself reflected too much woman, taking up too much space, making others uncomfortable simply by existing. I'm sorry, he said finally. But I can't. I thought I could, but I can't. Every time I look at you, all I can think about is how people would stare, how they'd whisper, how they'd wonder why a woman like you would settle for a man like me. I'm not strong enough for that kind of scrutiny. Miss Vance, I'm just not... The honesty of his weakness was more painful than cruelty would have been. Rachel uncrossed her arms, suddenly exhausted. Then go, she said. Take your guilty conscience and your dead wife's memory and go, but don't insult me by offering money. I came here of my own free will. I'll figure out my next steps the same way. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue. but something in her face must have warned him off. He settled his hat on his head, the gesture somehow final. "For what it's worth," he said at the door. "I think you're one of the finest women I've ever met. I wish I were a better man." "So do I," Rachel replied. After he left, she stood in the empty parlor, listening to his footsteps fade down the front walk. Through the lace curtains, she watched him mount his horse, a neat little mare that probably hadn't been 5 hands high, and ride away. He never looked back. "Mrs.?" Hooper appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand. "Well," she said, "that's that then?" "Yes," Rachel agreed. "That's that. Train comes through again day after tomorrow, eastbound." "I know, Mrs." Hooper studied her for a long moment. "But you're not taking it, are you?" Rachel turned from the window. "What makes you say that?" "Same thing that made me stay when my husband died and his brother offered to take me back to Ohio. Pure mule-headed stubbornness." She smiled slightly. "Though in your case, I'd say there's a fair measure of pride mixed in." "Pride," Rachel repeated. "Yes, I suppose there is too much of it, probably." "Nothing wrong with pride when it's all you've got left, Mrs." Hooper twisted the dish towel between her hands. "Room's paid through tomorrow. After that, we'll need to work something out." "I have money." "Not what I meant." The older woman's eyes were shrewd. "You mentioned in passing last night that you're handy with a needle. That true?" "I was a seamstress back in Cedar Rapids. Had my own shop before." Rachel trailed off. Before the owner of the building decided he needed it for his nephew. Before her regular customers started drifting away to younger, prettier seamstresses. Before she'd seen Thomas's advertisement and thought maybe, just maybe, she could start over somewhere new. "Can you mend?" "Of course. More than men take in, let out, make new from old." "Yes, all of that. Why, Mrs." Hooper smiled, the expression transforming her stern face. "Because Mrs. Chen, who does for the boarding houses and hotels, just told me yesterday her eyes aren't what they used to be. She's looking for someone to take over some of her work. Washing and mending for the single men, alterations for those who can afford it. It's not fancy work, but it's steady." Rachel felt something flutter in her chest, not quite hope, but adjacent to it. "You think she'd hire me?" "Can't say, but I know she's particular about her stitching. If you're as good as you claim, might be worth talking to her." "Mrs." Hooper paused. "That is, if you're planning to stay." Rachel thought about Thomas riding away on his little mare, about the train ticket back to Iowa she'd never buy, about the shop in Cedar Rapids that wasn't hers anymore. Then she thought about this morning, setting her spine straight at the breakfast table, refusing to shrink. "Yes," she said, "I believe I am." "Mrs." Hooper nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. "Mrs. Chen lives above the laundry on 2nd Street. Tell her I sent you." She turned to go, then paused. "And Miss Vance, when you walk through town today, and you will walk through town, because that's the only way to get anywhere, you keep that head up. You give them something to talk about. They'll talk, might as well make it worth their while." Rachel almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The landlady left, and Rachel returned to the window. Outside, Dust Hollow continued its morning routine, unaware or uncaring that her life had just taken another unexpected turn. Somewhere out there was a laundry, and above it, a woman who might need help. It wasn't what she'd come here for, wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was something. She'd stay, not for Thomas Reddick or for anyone else, but for herself. Because running back to Iowa would feel too much like admitting they were all right, all those people who'd told her she expected too much, reached too high, took up too much space. Rachel Eleanor Vance straightened her shoulders and prepared to walk through town, all 6 feet of her, looking for a Chinese laundry on 2nd Street and a new beginning that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with the simple act of refusing to disappear. The walk to 2nd Street took her past the Mercantile, the barber shop, and a saloon already conducting business despite the early hour. Rachel kept her eyes forward, her stride steady, but she felt the weight of every stare. Conversations paused mid-sentence as she passed. A group of women outside the general store stopped their chatter entirely, watching her with the intensity of crows eyeing something shiny and strange. She found the laundry by its smell soap and starch and hot water, clouds of steam escaping through the cracked door despite the cold. Above it, a narrow staircase led to what must be living quarters. Rachel climbed, her boots echoing on the worn wood, and knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps 60, Chinese, with silver threading through her black hair and hands that showed decades of hard work. She studied Rachel with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Hooper sent me about the sewing work." "Ah, Mrs." Chen stepped aside. "Come in. Too cold to talk in doorway." The apartment was small but meticulously clean, with pressed curtains at the windows and a sewing basket that could have been Rachel's own twin sitting by a cushioned chair. "Mrs." Chen gestured for her to sit, then took her own seat across a small tea table. "You are the tall woman from Iowa, the one Thomas Reddick was too frightened to marry." Rachel blinked at the directness. "Yes." "Good. I don't trust people who run from what surprises them." "Mrs." Chen poured tea from a pot that had been waiting on a small brazier. "Show me your hands." Rachel extended them, puzzled. "Mrs." Chen took them in her own, turning them over, examining the fingers, the calluses from years of needlework, the small scars where pins had found their mark. "Good hands, strong, steady." She released them. "What can you do?" "Everything," Rachel said simply. "Mending, alterations, construction. I can make a dress from a picture or remake an old one into new. I ran my own shop for 8 years." "Why did you close it?" "The building owner needed it for family, and—" Rachel hesitated, then opted for truth. Business had been slow. People prefer their seamstresses to be different than I am. "Mrs." Chen snorted. "People prefer many foolish things. Can you work with a difficult fabric canvas leather?" "Yes." "Can you mend so the repair is invisible?" "Yes." "Can you take man's shirt made for someone short and round and make it fit someone tall and thin without making it look remade?" "Yes, though it depends on how much fabric." "Good. You think before you promise." "Mrs." Chen sipped her tea. "I have contract with 3 boarding houses, the hotel, and many single men who need mending. Also some families who want alterations, special occasion clothes. My eyes." She touched her temple. 40 years of close work. Time to pass some of it on." "I'd be grateful for the work." Rachel said, "Not charity. You work hard or you don't work for me." "Mrs." Chen set down her cup with a decisive click. "Start tomorrow. Early. Bring your thimble, your needles. I provide thread, fabric for patches. You get paid by the piece, fair wages. But you earn them." "Understood." "Understood." "Good." "Mrs." Chen rose, then paused. "One more thing. You walk through my door. You work. I don't care if you're tall as a tree or wide as a barn door. I care if your stitches are straight. People talk about you here." "Yes." "Let them talk. Mouths that are busy gossiping aren't eating. So business is good." A small smile creased her weathered face. "Now go. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock. Don't be late." Rachel left the laundry feeling lighter than she had since stepping off the train. Work, real work, earned on her own merits, not charity or pity. She turned toward the boarding house, eager to tell Mrs. Hooper, when she nearly collided with someone coming out of the livery stable. "Whoa there!" Strong hands steadied her shoulders, then immediately released them. "My apologies, ma'am. Wasn't watching where I was going." Rachel looked down a novelty in itself at the man before her. He was perhaps 5'8" or 9, built solid as an oak barrel, with sandy hair that needed cutting and hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners. His clothes marked him as a working man: heavy canvas pants, flannel shirt, leather vest worn soft with use. "No harm done," she said, stepping back. He didn't stare. That was the first thing she noticed. His eyes met hers directly, without the usual journey upward, without the widening that typically followed. He simply looked at her as though tall women were an everyday occurrence in his world. "Colt Harland," he said, touching the brim of his worn hat. "I manage the horses over at Morrison's livery. Rachel Vance." "I know." At her look, he added, "Small town. News travels, especially news about—" He paused, seeming to search for words that wouldn't offend, "about folks who've had disappointing welcomes." There was something in the way he said it, a careful neutrality that somehow managed to convey sympathy without pity. Rachel found herself almost smiling. "That's one way to put it." "Well, there's other ways, but my mother raised me not to use that kind of language in front of ladies." This time, he did smile, and it transformed his plain features into something almost handsome. "You heading back to the boarding house?" "I am." "Mind if I walk with you? I'm going that way myself." "Got to check on Mrs. Hooper's coal delivery. She thinks the Johnston boys have been shorting her." They fell into step together. Rachel noticed he didn't try to speed up to compensate for her longer stride, just found a comfortable pace that worked for both of them. It was a small thing, but after Thomas's stammering discomfort, it felt like a gift. "You're not from here," she said. It wasn't a question. Something about him didn't fit the Dust Hollow mold. "Colorado originally. Came up here 2 years ago following work. Morrison needed someone good with horses. I needed a job. Worked out well enough." He glanced at her. "You planning to stay?" "Yes, Mrs. Chen just hired me to help with her sewing work." "Good for you. She's particular about who she works with. Must mean you're skilled." "I am," Rachel said simply. She'd spent too many years downplaying her abilities, making herself smaller in every way possible. No more. Colt nodded as if this confidence was perfectly natural. "Town could use a good seamstress. Mrs. Chen does fine work, but she can't keep up anymore. My own shirts." He plucked at his sleeve, where Rachel could see a mended tear that, while serviceable, wouldn't win any prizes for invisibility. "Well, let's say I'm better with horses than needles." They'd reached the boarding house. Colt paused at the gate, and Rachel found herself reluctant to end the conversation. When was the last time she'd talked with someone, really talked, not just exchanged pleasantries or deflected comments about her height? "Thank you for the company, Mr. Harland." "Colt," he corrected. "And it was my pleasure. Miss Vance, perhaps I'll see you around town." He touched his hat again and headed around the building toward the coal shed, whistling tunelessly. Rachel watched him go, noting the easy way he moved, the comfortable set of his shoulders, a man at peace with himself and his place in the world. Inside, she found Mrs. Hooper beating rugs with unnecessary vigor. "That Colt Harland I saw you talking with?" the landlady asked without preamble. "Yes, we met by accident outside the livery." Mrs. Hooper gave the rug another whack. "Good man. Colt. Quiet. Keeps to himself mostly. Not married, if you're wondering." "I wasn't," Rachel said quickly. "Course not." Another whack. "Just thought I'd mention it. Man who doesn't flinch at a woman's height is rarer than gold in these parts." Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was simply being polite. "Polite," Mrs. Hooper snorted. "Girl, I've lived in this town long enough to know the difference between polite and interested. That man looked at you like you were Christmas morning and his birthday rolled into one." "That's ridiculous. We just met." "So my Harold proposed the second time we met. Knew what he wanted and didn't see the point in waiting." She paused in her rug, beating. "Course, that was different." I was young and pretty and exactly the right height. You? She shook her head. You'll have to work harder for your happiness, but that doesn't mean it's not out there. Rachel escaped to her room. Mrs. Hooper's words following her up the stairs. Christmas morning and his birthday rolled into one. Absurd. She'd seen the way men looked at women they wanted. She'd just never been on the receiving end of those looks. Thomas had gazed at his memory of Mary with more warmth than he'd ever shown her. But Colt hadn't looked at her the way men usually did, with either dismissal or dismay. He'd looked at her like she was just a woman. Not a tall woman, not an oddity, not a problem to be solved. Just Rachel. She shook her head at her own foolishness. One pleasant conversation didn't mean anything. Tomorrow she'd start work with Mrs. Chen, begin building a life here that didn't depend on any man's approval. That was what mattered. Not hazel eyes that crinkled at the corners or the easy way he'd matched her stride. Through her window, she could see the stable yard where she'd watched the man with the bay mare the night before, as if summoned by her thoughts. Colt appeared, leading a different horse, a large black gelding that pranced and pulled at the lead rope. Colt remained patient, steady, speaking in low tones until the animal settled. He had good hands. She noticed, gentle but firm, knowing when to give and when to hold steady. A horseman's hands, competent and kind. Stop it, she told herself firmly. Turning from the window, she'd come here for marriage and found humiliation instead. The last thing she needed was to start spinning fantasies about the first man who'd shown her basic courtesy. But as she prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking not about Thomas Reddick's retreat or the whispers that would follow her through town, but about a man who hadn't stared, hadn't stammered, hadn't made her feel like a problem to be solved. A man who'd walked beside her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The man at the stable didn't laugh, she thought, remembering her first glimpse of him with the horses. No, he didn't laugh at all. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Rachel Vance fell asleep without wondering what was wrong with her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stares, new whispers. But it would also bring work she could be proud of and, perhaps, the chance to prove that she was more than just her height. In the stable yard, a horse whinnied softly. Through the thin walls, she could hear Colt's voice, steady and calm, answering back. The sound followed her into sleep. A lullaby of sorts for a woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as exactly what she was enough. The work was hard. Harder than her shop in Cedar Rapids had ever been. Rachel's first week with Mrs. Chen blurred into a rhythm of bent backs and flying needles. Mountains of mending that seemed to regenerate overnight. Torn trousers from the railway workers. Ripped shirts from the cowboys. Delicate repairs on ladies' Sunday best. Each piece told its own story of life lived rough in a rough country. Your stitches are good, Mrs. Chen said on the fourth day, examining a particularly tricky repair on a wool coat. Better than good. Where you learn... My mother first, Rachel said, not pausing in her work on a set of hotel curtains. Then apprenticed with a German woman in Des Moines. She'd trained in Berlin before coming to America. Said American women didn't know proper technique. Mrs. Chen snorted. Germans, always thinking they invented the needle. But her eyes showed approval. You take pride in the work. Good. Too many people today just want fast. Not good. Rachel had set up in the back room of the laundry. A space that had once been storage, but now housed 2 solid tables. Good light from a north-facing window. And more sewing notions than she'd owned in years. Word spread, as word did in small towns. The tall woman from Iowa could mend anything, make it look like new, and didn't gossip while she worked. That last part was particularly noted. Many seamstresses treated fitting sessions as opportunities to gather and dispense information. Rachel kept her mouth shut and her hands busy, and slowly, grudgingly, the women of Dust Hollow began to trust her with their best dresses and their husbands' suits. I'm not as fragile as I look, Mrs., Patterson said one afternoon, struggling with a heavy wool cloak. I know, Rachel replied, taking the garment from her. She'd heard the same phrase dozens of times since arriving, always from women who seemed to think height equaled strength, as if being tall meant she could carry the world on her shoulders without feeling the weight. But she was building something here, stitch by stitch. A reputation, a life, even a small savings, tucked away in a tea tin in her room at the boarding house. Colt Harland came by every Tuesday with a bundle of shirts and trousers, work clothes that bore evidence of his profession: horsehair, leather stains, the occasional rip from an errant hoof or nail. He never made excuses for the state of them, just handed them over with that easy smile and collected the previous week's mending. "Looks like you tangled with a wild cat," Rachel said one Tuesday, examining a shirt with 3 parallel tears across the back. "Close enough. New stallion Morrison bought, mean as sin and twice as pretty." He rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly. "Got me good before I got him settled." "You're hurt." The words came out sharper than intended. "Just bruised. Nothing that won't heal." He studied her with those hazel eyes. "But it's kind of you to worry." Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned back to the shirt. "I'm not worried. Just don't bleed on the fabric. Blood's harder to get out than anything except wine." He laughed, a warm sound that filled the small room. "I'll keep that in mind. Wouldn't want to make extra work for you." These Tuesday exchanges became the highlight of her week, though she'd never admit it. Colt had a way of talking that made even mundane topics interesting. He'd tell her about the horses, their personalities, their quirks, their histories. In return, she found herself sharing bits of her own life, carefully at first, then with growing ease. "Had a horse once," she told him one afternoon, working on his jacket while he waited. "Back in Iowa. A mare named Biscuit. Stupidest name for a horse. But she came with it and wouldn't answer to anything else." "What happened to her?" "Had to sell her when I closed the shop. Couldn't afford to keep her." The loss still stung, though she kept her voice level. "Hope she went to someone who appreciates a horse that thinks she's a lapdog." "Horses no good people," Colt said quietly. "I bet she remembers you." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. She focused on her stitching until the moment passed. It was Mrs. Hooper who pointed out what Rachel had been trying not to see. "That Harland boy's sweet on you," she announced one evening, apropos of nothing, as she served dinner. "Don't be ridiculous," Rachel said automatically. "Girl, I've got eyes. Man doesn't need his clothes mended every week. Half those tears look fresh made to me." "You're suggesting he's damaging his clothes on purpose?" "I'm suggesting a man who works with horses all day knows how to avoid getting his shirts torn up quite so regular." Mrs. Hooper set down the stew pot with emphasis. "Besides, Tuesday's the only day he bothers to shave middle of the week. You telling me that's coincidence?" Rachel hadn't noticed the shaving. She noticed now, filing it away with all the other things she'd been trying not to think about, the way he lingered after paying for his mending, the questions he asked about her day, the careful way he never mentioned her height except that once, early on, when he'd said, "Must be nice, being able to reach the top shelf without a ladder. I've got to climb like a monkey any time I need something stored high." She'd laughed, surprised. Most people acted like her height was either a tragedy or an affront. Colt treated it like he'd treat brown eyes or left-handedness, just another fact about her, neither good nor bad. The 5th week, she made a decision. When Colt arrived with his usual bundle, she had something waiting. "I made you a new shirt," she said, trying for casual and missing by a mile. "Your others are getting so thin they're more patched than original fabric." He stared at the shirt, good blue cotton, well made but not fancy, then at her. "You made this for me?" "It's nothing special, just practical. I had the fabric left over from another project." A lie. She'd bought it specially, spending too long choosing between the blue that would bring out his eyes and the green that would complement his coloring. Consider it a frequent customer discount. His fingers traced the neat stitching at the collar, the perfectly set sleeves. He cleared his throat. No one's ever made me anything before, not since my mother passed. Oh, Rachel fidgeted with her thimble. Well, it's just a shirt. No, he said quietly. It's not. Their eyes met and held for a long moment. Rachel felt something shift between them, delicate as spider silk, and just as strong. Then the bell over the front door chimed, breaking the spell, and Mrs. Patterson swept in with an armload of petticoats. Colt gestured vaguely at the door. Thank you, Miss Vance, for the shirt, He seemed to run out of words, settled for touching his hat, and fled. Mrs. Patterson watched him go with undisguised interest. My, wasn't that cozy? Did you need something, Mrs. Patterson? Rachel kept her voice cool, professional. Several things, actually, but first, a word of advice, woman to woman. She leaned against the counter, her expression shifting from gossip-hungry to something almost sympathetic. Colt Harland's a good man, one of the best in this town, but he's not ambitious, if you take my meaning. He's happy with his horses and his simple life. A woman like you, with skills and sense, could do better. Better than what? Than a stable hand. Oh, I know he runs the place for Morrison, but it's not the same as owning. Is it? You could have a shop again, make something of yourself, maybe in a bigger town where... She gestured vaguely at Rachel's height, where things are different. Rachel set down her work carefully, using the moment to control her temper. Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not looking for better. I'm not looking for anything at all. I'm just trying to earn a living. Of course. Mrs. Patterson's smile was knowing. Just remember, dear, we all settle for something in the end. Make sure what you're settling for is worth it. After she left, Rachel stood in the quiet room, hands shaking slightly. The woman's words burrowed under her skin like splinters. Settling. Is that what she'd be doing? Trading her dreams of a proper shop, a prosperous life, for a man who was kind and steady but nothing more. But then she thought about Colt's face when he'd seen the shirt, the wonder in it. When was the last time anyone had looked at something she'd made, something she'd done with such genuine appreciation? That night, she dreamed of her shop in Cedar Rapids, the bell over the door, the bolts of fabric lining the walls, the mannequin in the window wearing her latest creation. She woke with tears on her cheeks, mourning something that had been taken from her not by fire or flood, but by the slow erosion of whispered words and turned away faces. The next Tuesday, Colt wore the blue shirt. Fits perfect, he said, and she could see it did. She'd guessed at his measurements, but her eye was good. The shoulders sat just right, the length perfect for tucking into his work pants. I'm glad, she said, and meant it. He hesitated, then pulled something from his pocket. I brought you something. No, it's not much, but I thought... He placed a small carved horse on her work table. Made it myself. Figured you might like it, since you mentioned missing your biscuit. The carving was simple but skillful, capturing the essence of a horse in motion. Rachel picked it up, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It's beautiful, she said softly. You made this. Winter evenings get long. Man needs something to do with his hands. He shifted, uncomfortable with the praise. It's just pine, nothing fancy. But it was perfect, a gift made with time and thought, worth more than any store-bought trinket. Rachel set it carefully on her windowsill where it would catch the light. Thank you, she said, and for once didn't try to diminish the moment with practical words. They stood there, two people who'd learned to expect less from life than it had promised, finding in each other something neither had dared hope for. Not passion, perhaps, not the stuff of romance novels or dramatic tales. Just recognition, just possibility. I should go, Colt said finally. Got a buyer coming to look at the bay mare this afternoon. Of course. He made it to the door before turning back. Rachel, would you... That is, there's a social at the church Saturday night. Nothing fancy, just neighbors getting together. Would you consider going with me? Mrs. Patterson's words echoed in her mind. Settling, but looking at Colt steady. Kind Colt, who saw her as she was and didn't flinch. Rachel thought maybe there were worse things than settling, like spending your whole life reaching for something that didn't want to reach back. I'd like that, she said. His smile could have lit the whole room. Saturday, then. I'll come by around 7. 7, she agreed. After he left, Rachel returned to her work, but her hands moved automatically while her mind wandered. A social, dancing, probably. She'd be taller than him in her boots, tower over most everyone there. People would stare, whisper, judge. But Colt would be there. Steady Colt with his horseman's hands and his carved gifts and his shirts that maybe didn't need quite so much mending after all. I'm not as fragile as I look, she murmured to the empty room, practicing words she might need Saturday night. From the windowsill, the little wooden horse caught the afternoon sun, casting a shadow that stretched long across her work table. Like her, Rachel thought with a small smile, taking up more space than expected, but beautiful in its way. For the first time in years, she let herself look forward to a dance. Saturday arrived wrapped in doubt and determination. Rachel stood before her small mirror, wearing the dress she'd labored over for 3 nights navy blue wool. Unfashionably simple but well cut. The color deep as evening sky. She'd taken it in at the waist, let out the hem as far as the fabric would allow, creating lines that flattered rather than emphasized her height. Lord have mercy, Mrs. Hooper said from the doorway. You clean up nice, girl. It's too much. Rachel smoothed the skirt nervously. I should wear something else. The brown... You wear that brown dress, and I'll burn it myself. Mrs. Hooper stepped into the room, carrying something green. Here, this was my mother's. Thought it might suit. It was a shawl, soft cashmere wool in deep forest green, fringed with silk tassels. Rachel draped it around her shoulders, and suddenly, the dress looked complete, elegant even. I can't accept this. Borrow, not keep, though Lord knows I've got no use for fancy shawls these days. Mrs. Hooper adjusted the drape with practiced hands. There. Now you look like a woman going to a social, not a funeral. The sound of boots on stairs made them both turn. Colt appeared in the doorway, then stopped dead, his eyes widening. He'd dressed with care, clean black trousers, a white shirt Rachel recognized as one she'd mended, a wool vest that looked new. His hair was slicked back, still damp from washing, and he'd shaved so recently she could smell the soap. Miss Vance, his voice came out rough. He cleared his throat, tried again. Rachel, you look... Tall, she supplied, the old defense mechanism kicking in. Beautiful, he corrected firmly. You look beautiful. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge to the universe. No one had ever called Rachel beautiful. Handsome. Sometimes, in that patronizing way that meant not pretty, but we need to say something nice. But beautiful never. Well, don't just stand there gawking, Mrs. Hooper said briskly. You've got a social to get to. The walk to the church was quiet, their footsteps crunching on frozen ground. Rachel had refused his arm at first, hyper-aware of the picture they made, she in her low boots still matching his height, probably looking like a mother walking with her son. But Colt simply offered again, patient, until she took it. Nervous, he asked. Terrified, she admitted. Good, me too. We can be terrified together. Despite herself, she smiled. What do you have to be nervous about? This is your town, your people. Maybe, but I've never walked in with someone like you before. She stiffened. Someone tall, You mean someone who matters, he said quietly. Big difference between showing up alone and showing up with someone you want to impress. Before she could respond to that, they'd reached the church. Lights spilled from the windows, and the sound of fiddle music drifted on the cold air. Through the glass, Rachel could see couples already dancing, children darting between their parents' legs, older folks sitting along the walls watching it all with indulgent smiles. We don't have to go in, Colt said, reading her hesitation. We could walk instead, or I could take you home. No. Rachel squared her shoulders, lifted her chin. I'm done running from rooms. They entered together, and yes, the conversation stuttered. Yes, heads turned. Yes, she heard someone whisper, Lord above, she's even taller than I heard. But Colt's hand was steady on her elbow, and he guided her through the crowd like he was gentling a spooked horse, calm, confident, giving her time to adjust. Colt Harland, as I live and breathe. A woman bustled up, round and cheerful, with graying hair pinned in elaborate curls. And this must be Miss Vance. I'm Flora Morrison. My husband owns the livery where this rascal pretends to work. Pretends, Colt protested mildly. I'll remember that next time your husband needs help with that devil of a stallion. Mrs. Morrison laughed, a rich sound that drew others into their circle. Don't mind him, dear, best horseman in 3 counties, even if he won't admit it. She studied Rachel with bright, curious eyes. I hear you're working miracles with a needle and thread. My daughter Rose has a dress that needs altering for her wedding. Think you could help? And just like that, Rachel found herself drawn into conversation about weddings and dresses and the challenge of finding good lace this far from Denver. Other women drifted over, attracted by talk of fashion and fabric. She answered questions about her work, shared advice about removing stubborn stains, admired Mrs. Patterson's new collar that she detached just yesterday. When the fiddler struck up a reel, Colt appeared at her elbow. Dance! Rachel glanced at the couples forming sets. I don't know the steps to this one. Neither do half the people here. Come on. He held out his hand. If we make fools of ourselves, at least we'll do it together. She let him lead her onto the floor. The dance was energetic, involving a lot of switching partners and weaving between other couples. Rachel found herself passed from hand to hand the banker Mr. Stone, who barely came to her shoulder but gamely swung her around. Young Tom Morrison, who blushed furiously the whole time. Even Thomas Reddick, who mumbled an apology as they do-si-doed. But always she came back to Colt, who caught her hands like he'd been waiting for her, who matched her pace and never made her feel like she needed to shrink. When the reel ended, she was breathless, laughing, more alive than she'd felt in years. Water, Colt suggested, and she nodded gratefully. He was fetching cups from the refreshment table when a man Rachel didn't recognize approached tall himself, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone used to being noticed. I don't believe we've been introduced, he said smoothly. James Hartwell. I own the bank in Cedar Junction, just passing through on business. His eyes traveled up and down her height with an assessment that made her skin crawl. My, you're a striking woman. Tell me, have you ever considered moving to a larger town? Cedar Junction has opportunities for a woman of unique proportions. The way he said it made her height sound like something to be exhibited, capitalized on. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Colt was suddenly there, pressing a cup of water into her hands. Hartwell, he said pleasantly, though Rachel noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. Didn't know you were in town. Business, my boy. Always business. Hartwell's smile was sharp. I was just telling Miss Vance, Rachel supplied coolly. Miss Vance that she's wasted in a backwater like Dust Hollow. A woman like her could make quite a name for herself in the right circumstances. She's already making a name for herself, Colt said, as the finest seamstress in the territory. Hartwell laughed. Seamstress? My dear boy, you're thinking too small. Why, properly presented. I could be standing right here, listening to you discuss me like livestock, Rachel interrupted, her voice cutting through his pomposity like shears through silk. Which I am, and I'm not interested in being properly presented by anyone. Mr. Hartwell, if you'll excuse us. She turned away, Colt following, leaving Hartwell standing there with his mouth slightly open. Nicely done, Colt murmured once they were out of earshot. I've had practice, but her hands were shaking slightly. Men like Hartwell reminded her why she'd been so ready to leave Iowa, to answer Thomas's advertisement. The constant feeling of being appraised, measured, found wanting or too much or just wrong. The fiddler was tuning up for a waltz, slower and more intimate than the previous dances. Couples were already taking the floor, and Rachel started to suggest they sit this one out when Colt set down his cup and offered his hand again. Unless you're tired. She wasn't tired. She was terrified again, because the waltz meant standing close, moving together, no switching partners to break the intimacy. But his eyes were steady on hers, patient and warm, and she found herself nodding. They took their position, her hand on his shoulder, his on her waist, this close. She could smell the soap he'd used, see the faint scar on his jaw from some long-ago accident. He had to look up to meet her eyes, but he did it without strain, without making her feel like a giant. Ready? He asked softly. No, she admitted, but let's do it anyway. They moved into the dance, and it was easy, natural. Colt led with confidence, adjusting naturally to her longer stride, and Rachel found herself relaxing into the rhythm. Around them, other couples swirled. But for these few minutes, they might have been alone. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For tonight? For asking me? For... She struggled for words. For seeing me as someone worth asking. His hand tightened slightly on her waist. Rachel, can I tell you something? She nodded. First time I saw you, that day outside the livery, I thought you were the most magnificent woman I'd ever seen. Not beautiful in the usual way, striking, like a thoroughbred among ponies. Took my breath clean away. Colt, let me finish. I know I'm not much, stable hand with rough hands and no prospects to speak of, but I also know quality when I see it, whether it's horses or people. And you, he spun her gently, brought her back, your quality through and through. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. You're wrong about one thing, she managed. You're not much. You're kind and steady, and you see people truly. That's worth more than all the prospects in the world. They finished the waltz in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of possibility. When the music ended, they stood for a moment, reluctant to break apart. Well, someone said loudly, isn't that sweet? They turned to find a group of younger men, ranch hands by their look, whiskey brave and smirking. Colt's got himself a woman who can reach the high shelves for him. One continued, practical, I guess. Leave it, Johnson, Colt said quietly, but Rachel could feel the tension in him now, coiled tight. Just making conversation. Johnson's grin was mean. Must be nice. Colt, never have to worry about her wearing your shirts, they'd be dresses on her. The laughter was ugly, designed to hurt. Rachel had heard variations of it her whole life. She started to step back, to retreat when Colt moved. Not violently, he simply stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carrying, pitched to reach not just the ranch hands, but everyone nearby who'd turned to watch. You're right, Johnson. Rachel could wear my shirts as dresses. She can also outsew anyone in 3 counties, run a business, and face down fools with more grace than they deserve. I'm proud to stand with her, proud she chose to come here with me tonight, if that bothers you. Well, he smiled, and it wasn't entirely friendly. I guess that's your problem to work out. The silence stretched taut, then misses. Morrison's voice cut through. "Play another waltz, Harold. These young people came here to dance, not jaw at each other like roosters." The fiddler, Harold apparently, struck up another tune. Couples moved back onto the floor, the moment breaking apart. Johnson and his friends drifted away, trying to look like it was their idea. "You didn't have to do that," Rachel said softly. "Yes, I did." Colt turned back to her. "Want to dance again, or we could get some air? Or I could take you home, whatever you want." What she wanted, Rachel realized with sudden clarity, was to stop being afraid, to stop letting other people's words and looks drive her into corners, to stop apologizing for existing in the body God gave her. "I want to dance," she said, "every dance, until they run out of music." Colt's smile was like sunrise. "Then that's what we'll do." And they did, dance after dance, until her feet hurt and her face ached from smiling. They danced fast ones and slow ones, traditional reels and newfangled waltzes. Sometimes people stared. Sometimes they whispered. But more often than not, they simply got out of the way and let them pass. Two people finding joy in movement and music and each other. When the evening finally wound down, Colt walked her home through streets silvered with frost. At the boarding house gate, he stopped, suddenly shy again. "I hope you had a good time, despite—" "Because," Rachel corrected. "I had a good time because you asked me, because you stood up for me, because you danced with me like I was worth dancing with." "You are," he said simply, "worth that and more." They stood there in the cold, neither quite ready for the evening to end. Finally, Colt cleared his throat. "There's another social next month. Would you—" "Yes," Rachel said before he could finish. "Yes, I'll go with you." His smile warmed her better than any fire. "Good night, Rachel." "Good night, Colt." She watched him walk away, whistling soft and tuneless in the dark. Then she climbed the stairs to her room, where Mrs. Hooper was certainly waiting up to hear every detail. The little wooden horse stood on her windowsill, catching moonlight now instead of sun. Rachel touched it gently, remembering the evening, the good and the bad, the dancing and the ugliness, all of it mixed together like life itself. She'd been called beautiful tonight, had been defended, celebrated, chosen, for the first time in her life. She'd spent an entire evening at a social without once wishing she could shrink. "I'm not as fragile as I look," she told her reflection, and for the first time, truly believed it. The nightmare came as it always did, in the darkest part of night when her defenses were lowest. Rachel was back in Cedar Rapids, standing in her shop as the landlord explained why she had to leave. "It's nothing personal," he was saying, while his eyes traveled up and up. "It's just that customers find you unsettling." She woke with her face turned hard against the wall. Her body curled as small as she could make it a habit from childhood when she'd first started outgrowing her sisters, trying to take up less space in the bed they shared. The room was cold, the fire having died to embers, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Dust Hollow, the boarding house, the social with Colt. The memories of the evening rushed back, dancing, laughter. Colt's fierce defense of her, and with them came a familiar fear. It had been too good, too much like a dream. Experience had taught her that when life offered her something sweet, it usually followed with something bitter. She forced herself to uncurl, to face the room instead of the wall. Through her window, she could see snow beginning to fall, fat flakes that would make travel difficult by morning. It was Sunday, no work today, just the long stretch of hours to fill with worry about what Monday might bring. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Hooper's voice came through the door. "You awake? Girl got coffee on." Rachel dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was warm, filled with the smell of coffee and baking bread. Mrs. Hooper was at the stove, already dressed for church despite the early hour. "Couldn't sleep either?" the older woman asked, pouring coffee without waiting for an answer. bad dreams, Rachel admitted, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. About last night. About before. About why I left Iowa. Mrs. Hooper settled across from her with her own cup. Want to talk about it? Rachel almost said no. She'd learned to keep her disappointments close, like bruises that hurt worse when exposed to air. But something about the kitchen's warmth and Mrs. Hooper's matter-of-fact kindness loosened her tongue. I had a shop, she began. Small, but mine. Built it up over 8 years. Had regular customers. Was even thinking about hiring a girl to help with the simple work. She stared into her coffee. Then Mr. Garrett, the building owner, decided he needed the space for his nephew. Gave me 2 weeks to clear out. That's not right. Legal, though, and when I tried to find another space, Rachel shrugged. Somehow, every landlord in town had just rented to someone else, or the space wasn't suitable, or the rent was suddenly double what they'd advertised. Because of your height. Because of everything. My height, my age. The fact that I'd turned down too many sons and nephews and cousins over the years. Small towns have long memories. Mrs. Hooper snorted. Don't I know it? When my Harold died, his brother suggested I marry his son, my own nephew by marriage, said it would keep the property in the family. When I refused, suddenly no one needed their laundry done by the widow Hooper anymore. What did you do? Survived. Same as you're doing. She refilled both their cups. Though I notice you're doing more than surviving lately. That Colt Harland looked ready to take on the whole room for you last night. Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was just being kind. Girl, that wasn't kindness. That was a man staking a claim. Mrs. Hooper studied her shrewdly. Question is, are you going to let him? Before Rachel could answer, they heard the front door slam and boots stomping. Colt's voice called out, urgent, Mrs. Hooper, is Miss Vance? Rachel, is she here? They both rose as he burst into the kitchen. His coat was covered in snow, his face red with cold and something else worry. What's wrong? Rachel asked, her heart suddenly racing. The storm, he said, slightly out of breath. Came in faster than expected. The pass is already closing. I know you sometimes work Sundays, catching up on mending, and I was worried you might try to get to the laundry. I wasn't planning to go out, Rachel said, touched by his concern. But thank you for checking. He sagged with relief. Good, good, Mrs. Chen's place is solid, but that hill gets treacherous in weather like this. He seemed to realize he was dripping on the clean floor. Sorry, I should go. Nonsense, Mrs. Hooper interrupted. You'll catch your death going back out in this. Sit, have coffee, wait for the worst to pass. I couldn't impose. Sit, Mrs. Hooper commanded, already reaching for another cup. Lord knows we could use a strong back when it comes time to bring in more wood. Colt sat, peeling off his wet coat. Underneath, Rachel noticed, he wore the blue shirt she'd made him. It was wrinkled, like he'd grabbed it in a hurry. You didn't have to come check on me, she said softly. Yes, I did. He accepted the coffee gratefully. Kept thinking about you trying to navigate that hill in this weather. Couldn't settle until I knew you were safe. Mrs. Hooper made a noise that might have been approval and bustled off, muttering about checking on other boarders. Rachel and Colt were left alone in the kitchen, acutely aware of each other. About last night, Colt began. I hope I didn't embarrass you, standing up to Johnson and the others like that. You didn't embarrass me, you... Rachel searched for words. No one's ever done that for me before. Defended me like I was worth defending. You are worth defending. Worth a lot more than that. He set down his cup, leaned forward. Rachel, I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear it. She nodded, suddenly nervous. I know you think I'm just being kind, that maybe I feel sorry for you or I'm settling for what I can get. But that's not true. His hazel eyes were intense, holding hers. When I see you, I don't see a woman who's too tall or too old or too anything. I see someone strong and talented and brave. Someone who came to a strange town alone and made a place for herself through sheer will and skill. Colt, let me finish, please. He took a breath. I've been alone a long time. Thought I was fine with it. Then you walked into town and suddenly I wasn't fine anymore. Suddenly I was counting days until Tuesday, damaging my clothes just to have an excuse to see you more. Mrs. Hooper said you were doing that, Rachel murmured. Smart woman. A small smile crossed his face, then faded. I'm not much. Rachel, I've got a decent job in a small cabin on Morrison's land, and that's about it. But what I have, what I am, it's yours if you want it, all of it. The kitchen was so quiet Rachel could hear the snow hitting the windows, the tick of the old clock on the mantel, her own heart beating too fast. She'd been proposed to before, if you could call Thomas's letters a proposal, but never like this. Never by someone who looked at her like she was precious. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I've spent so long protecting myself, turning away before anyone could reject me. I sleep facing the wall because it's easier than facing disappointment. I know, Colt said gently. I've seen how you hold yourself apart, like you're waiting for the blow to fall, but I'm not going to hurt you, Rachel, not if I can help it. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise to try. To see you truly, not just look at you, to stand beside you, not in front or behind, to dance with you at every social, even when my feet give out. Despite everything, Rachel found herself almost smiling at that last part. Your feet did give out. I saw you limping during the last reel. Worth it. He reached across the table, palm up, offering, What do you say? Rachel, will you let me court you properly? Let me prove that what I feel isn't pity or settling, but something real. Rachel stared at his outstretched hand, work-roughened, steady, patient. She thought about her dream, about sleeping turned to the wall, about all the years of making herself smaller in every way but the one that mattered. Slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. Is that a yes? That's a we'll see, she said. But she was smiling now. Court me properly. Colt Harland. Show me this isn't just a lovely dream I'll wake from. I will, he promised. Every day if you'll let me. Mrs. Hooper chose that moment to bustle back in, took one look at their joined hands, and nodded with satisfaction. About time, now, Colt, about that firewood. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of ordinary tasks, made extraordinary by Colt's presence. He brought in wood, fixed a shutter that had been banging, even helped serve breakfast to the other boarders who'd made it down through the snow. Rachel found herself watching him, noting the easy way he moved, the gentle patience with which he helped old Mr. Garrett, no relation to her Cedar Rapids landlord, thankfully navigate the icy steps. When the storm finally began to ease, Colt prepared to leave. At the door, he paused, touched Rachel's cheek with cold fingers. Don't sleep facing the wall tonight, he said softly. Face the room, face the world. You've got nothing to hide from. After he left, Rachel stood in the doorway, watching his figure disappear into the swirling snow. Mrs. Hooper appeared at her elbow, shawl wrapped tight. That's a good man, the older woman said. I know. Don't let fear cheat you out of happiness, girl. God knows life's hard enough without us making it harder on ourselves. That night, Rachel lay in bed as snow continued to fall, transforming Dust Hollow into something clean and new. She started out facing the wall from habit, then deliberately turned over. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating her small room, her dresses hanging on pegs, the little wooden horse on the windowsill, the sewing basket in the corner. Her life, her choices, her future, maybe, with a man who saw her truly. Don't turn away tonight, she whispered into the darkness. echoing words not yet spoken but somehow already known. "You've done that too many times before." And for the first time in years, she fell asleep facing the open room, the unlived life, the possibility of being loved not despite who she was, but because of it. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in white, covering old tracks and making room for new ones. In her dreams, Rachel danced tall and proud and unashamed, with a partner who matched her step for step, who never once suggested she should be anything other than exactly what she was. She woke, smiling, face turned toward the dawn. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. Rachel was working on Flora Morrison's daughter's wedding dress, carefully attaching pearl buttons down the back, when young Sam Mitchell burst through the door of the laundry. "Miss Vance," the boy was gasping, face red from running. "You got to come quick. There's been an accident at the livery." The pearl button she'd been holding fell from nerveless fingers. "Colt." "Yes'm. That new stallion, the mean one, Mr. Morrison bought last month, roof beam came down in his stall. Spooked him bad. He went wild, kicked through the wall, brought half the barn down." Rachel was already grabbing her coat, her hands shaking. "Is he how bad?" "Doc's with him now, but he's asking for you. Keep saying your name over and over." She ran through the streets, her long legs eating up the distance, not caring who stared. The livery was in chaos when she arrived, men milling about, horses being led to temporary shelter, Morrison himself directing the cleanup with a face gray as ash. "Where is he?" she demanded. "My office," Morrison said. "Doc Miller's with him. Miss Vance, Rachel, he's hurt bad. The beam caught him across the back when he pushed Jimmy out of the way. If he hadn't—" But Rachel was already pushing past him, through the door to the small office. The scene that greeted her stole her breath. Colt lay on his stomach on Morrison's desk, shirt cut away, revealing a back mottled with bruises so dark they looked black. Doc Miller was bent over him, hands gentle but face grim. "Rachel," Colt's voice was thin, threaded with pain. "I'm here." She moved to where he could see her, dropping to her knees beside the desk. His face was pale, tight with hurt, but his eyes found hers and held. "Knew you'd come," he whispered. "Of course I came. You think a little barn falling down would keep me away?" She tried for light, achieved something closer to desperate. Doc Miller straightened, wiping his hands. 3 ribs cracked, maybe broken, deep bruising along the spine. He's lucky another few inches and that beam would have... He shook his head. "He needs rest, complete rest, and someone to watch him. The danger with injuries like this is the swelling, the chance of internal damage we can't see." "He can't stay here," Morrison said from the doorway. "Not with the barn half down and snow coming again." "I'll take him," Rachel said immediately. "To the boarding house. We have an empty room on the ground floor. I'll watch him." "Miss Vance," Doc Miller said carefully. "He'll need round-the-clock care for at least a week. Possibly more. It's not proper." "Propriety can hang itself," Rachel snapped. "He's hurt. He needs care. I'm going to give it to him." The men exchanged glances over her head, but something in her face must have warned them off arguing. Within an hour, they'd managed to transport Colt to the boarding house, settling him carefully in the small room off the kitchen that Mrs. Hooper sometimes used for storage. "Well, Mrs. Hooper said, surveying the situation with her usual practicality, "I suppose we're running a hospital now. Good thing that gossip, Mrs. Patterson is visiting her sister in Denver. We'll have him on his feet before she gets back to cluck about it." Colt drifted in and out of consciousness that first day, burning with fever as his body fought the trauma. Rachel sat beside him, bathing his face with cool cloths, spooning willow bark tea between his lips when he could manage it. Mrs. Hooper brought meals Rachel couldn't eat, took away cold cups of coffee, and eventually just left a pot warming by the fire. "You'll make yourself sick," she warned. "Then who'll take care of him?" But Rachel couldn't leave, every time she tried. Colt would stir, reaching out, calling her name, so she stayed, holding his hand, talking to him about nothing about her work, about the wooden horse on her windowsill, about the dress she was making for Rose Morrison, and how the girl had specifically requested Rachel do the work because you're the only one who understands that tall girls want pretty things too. The second night was the worst. Colt's fever spiked, and he became delirious, speaking to people who weren't there. Rachel heard him talking to his mother, apologizing for something. To Morrison, promising the horses would be cared for, and to her, over and over, words that made her heart ache. "Should have told her sooner," he muttered, eyes glazed and unseeing. "Should have said, too tall. They said, too tall for the likes of you, but they're wrong. She's perfect. Rachel's perfect. Just want to give her things. Pretty things. A house. Babies. Can't, though. Not enough. Never enough for her." "Hush," Rachel whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Rest now. Just rest." Doc Miller came by twice a day, examining Colt with careful hands, listening to his breathing. On the third day, he pronounced the fever breaking. "He'll mend," he told Rachel. "Thanks to your care, though you look like you could use some care yourself. When's the last time you slept?" She couldn't remember. The days had blurred together into a cycle of watching, worrying, praying to a God she'd half stopped believing in. But Colt was breathing easier now, the terrible tension leaving his face. "I'll sleep when he wakes properly," she said. It happened that evening. Rachel was dozing in her chair, still holding his hand, when she felt his fingers tighten around hers. She opened her eyes to find him watching her, truly conscious for the first time in days. "Rachel." His voice was hoarse but clear. "What? Where?" "You're at the boarding house. There was an accident at the livery. You've been hurt, but you're going to be fine." The words tumbled out in a rush of relief. "Don't try to move. Your ribs." "You look terrible," he said, and despite everything, there was a hint of his usual humor in it. "Well, you look worse," she retorted, then promptly burst into tears. "Hey, now." He tried to reach for her, winced at the movement. "Don't cry, please. Can't stand it when you cry." "I'm not crying," she said, wiping furiously at her cheeks. "I'm just relieved and tired and angry at you for scaring me half to death. Sorry." He studied her face, taking in the shadows under her eyes, the wrinkled dress she'd been wearing for 3 days. "You stayed with me." "Of course I stayed. You kept asking for me, calling my name, saying—" She stopped, flushing. "What was I saying?" There was something careful in his voice now. Rachel looked away. "Nothing important. Fever talk." "Rachel." He waited until she met his eyes. "What did I say?" She could lie, could protect them both from words spoken in delirium. But looking at him pale and hurt, but so vitally alive, she found she couldn't. "You said I was perfect," she whispered, "that you wanted to give me things, a house, a family, but that you weren't enough." His face went very still. "I meant it, all of it, even the part about not being enough." "You're wrong," she said fiercely. "You've always been wrong about that. You think I care about money or position or what people think I spent 3 days watching you breathe, terrified each breath might be your last. And all I could think was how empty my life would be without your Tuesday visits, without your carved horses and your patient hands, and the way you look at me like I'm not too much of anything." "You're not," he said. "You're not too much. You're exactly right. I can't even get out of bed without help. How can I ask you to tie yourself to someone who can't protect you, can't provide—" "Stop!" Rachel leaned forward, careful not to jostle him. "Listen to me. Colt Harland, you threw yourself between Jimmy and a falling beam. You've defended me against cruel words and crueler laughter. You provide more with your kindness and your steady presence than most men could with all the money in the world. But—" "No." She was crying again, but smiling through it. No buts. You're enough, more than enough. And when you're healed, when you can stand and walk and lift your arms without wincing, you can court me properly like you promised. But right now, you're going to rest and get better and stop talking nonsense about not being enough for me." He was quiet for a long moment, searching her face. "You really stayed 3 days." 3 days, 4 nights. Mrs. Hooper's been feeding me soup and threatening to tie me to a bed if I don't rest soon." Smart woman. His eyes were drooping, exhaustion pulling him under. "Rachel, can you stay a little longer just until I fall asleep?" "Yes," she said simply. "I'll stay." She kept her word, sitting beside him as his breathing deepened into sleep. Only then did she let Mrs. Hooper bully her upstairs for a proper rest, but she left the doors open between them, so she'd hear if he called for her. The next days passed in a blur of careful nursing. Colt was a terrible patient once the immediate danger passed restless, eager to return to work, frustrated by his body's slow healing. Rachel found herself having to be firm, even stern, keeping him in bed when he wanted to rise. "The horses need me," he protested on the 5th day. "Morrison's hired temporary help. The horses are fine." "But, Colt Harland, if you try to get out of that bed one more time, I'll sit on you," Rachel threatened. "And we both know I'm big enough to keep you down." He laughed, then winced as it pulled his ribs. "Yes, ma'am." She helped him with everything those first days: eating, drinking, the embarrassing necessities of life when one couldn't stand unaided. Any barriers of propriety between them dissolved in the face of simple need. She saw him at his weakest, and he saw her at her most exhausted and unkempt, and somehow it only drew them closer. "I didn't come here for nursing work," she told him one afternoon, gently rubbing liniment into the healing bruises. "But I seem to have a talent for it." "You have a talent for kindness," he corrected, "though your bedside manner could use work. Very bossy. Someone has to be. You'd be trying to break horses already if I let you." "Probably," he admitted. "Rachel, when I'm healed, there's something I need to ask you, properly, the way you deserve." She stilled, hands resting lightly on his back. "Oh, but not like this. Not when I can't even stand to face you proper. Not when you've had to see me weak as a kitten." "I don't mind seeing you like this," she said softly. "It doesn't make you less in my eyes. Just human. Just mine to care for." The word mine hung between them, heavy with meaning. Colt turned his head to look at her, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart race. "Yours," he agreed quietly. "If you'll have me, when I can ask proper." Rachel leaned down and, greatly daring, pressed a kiss to his temple. "Get well first, then ask me anything you want." He smiled, the first full, genuine smile she'd seen since the accident. "Yes, ma'am. I'll do my best." And he did, fighting his way back to strength with the same patient determination he used with difficult horses. Day by day, he improved, sitting up, then standing, then taking careful steps around the room. Rachel was there for all of it, steady as the mountains, ready to catch him if he fell. He never did, not once. And if sometimes their hands lingered when she helped him walk, if sometimes he looked at her like she was everything good in the world, if sometimes she forgot to let go even after he was steady well, that was between them and the four walls that had witnessed their quiet transformation from friends to something deeper, stronger, forged in fear and tempered by tenderness. The town would talk when he emerged. They always did. But Rachel found she no longer cared what they said. She'd found something worth more than approval or propriety. She'd found someone who saw her truly, who needed her specifically, who whispered her name in fever dreams and reached for her hand in waking. She'd found home in the last place she'd expected, not in a building or a town, but in a man's eyes, a man's trust, a man's slowly healing body that she'd helped put back together with patience and love and really terrible soup that Mrs. Hooper insisted on making. "Almost there," she told him on the 10th day, as he walked the length of the room unassisted. Soon you'll be back to your horses. Soon I'll be able to do more than walk, he said, and something in his voice made her shiver. Soon, Rachel Vance, I'll be able to court you the way I promised, properly, in front of the whole town. I'll hold you to that, she said, and meant it. News traveled fast in Dust Hollow, but gossip traveled faster. By the time Colt was well enough to return to light work at the livery, the whole town knew about Rachel's devoted nursing. The reactions were predictably mixed. Scandalous. Mrs. Patterson declared, having returned from Denver with her sister's opinions to add to her own. An unmarried woman spending nights with an unmarried man. Even if he was injured, what kind of example does that set? She said this while standing in the very laundry where Rachel had returned to work, apparently seeing no irony in bringing her mending to the woman she was condemning. The kind where Christian charity matters more than appearances. Mrs., Chen said sharply, not looking up from her pressing. You want different seamstress many in Denver, I hear. Mrs., Patterson huffed but didn't take her business elsewhere. Good seamstresses were hard to find, and principals had a way of bending when it came to well-fitted clothing. But for every Mrs. Patterson, there was a Mrs. Morrison, who stopped Rachel on the street to squeeze her hands. What you did for Colt, that was real goodness. Don't let anyone tell you different. The divide in the town became increasingly clear. There were those who saw Rachel's actions as improper, a confirmation that she was indeed too much too tall, too bold, too willing to flout convention. And there were those who saw a woman who'd put compassion above reputation, who'd saved a good man through sheer determination. The tension came to a head at the monthly town meeting, held in the church on a cold Thursday evening. Rachel hadn't planned to attend, she never did, seeing no point in subjecting herself to stares and whispers. But Mrs. Hooper insisted. You've got as much right to be there as anyone, she said firmly. More, considering how much mending you do for half these hypocrites. So Rachel found herself sitting in a back pew, trying to remain inconspicuous, a futile effort given her height. The meeting droned on through the usual business road repairs, plans for the spring festival, disputes over water rights. She was beginning to drowse when she heard her name. Matter of moral standards in our community, Mrs. Patterson was saying, having somehow seized the floor. We have certain expectations of behavior, especially from our unmarried women. Recent events have shown a concerning lack of... Oh, for heaven's sake, Patricia... Mrs. Hooper stood up, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Just say what you mean. You think Miss Vance should be run out of town for having the audacity to save a man's life. I never said... You've said plenty, just not to her face. Mrs. Hooper's eyes swept the room. This woman came to our town with nothing but hope in a trunk. She's worked hard, minded her business, and helped anyone who asked. When Colt Harland lay injured, she didn't calculate the cost to her reputation. She just helped. If that's not Christian behavior, I don't know what is. But the impropriety, someone else began, was necessary. Doc Miller interrupted, standing slowly. I examined Colt Harland every day of his recovery. Without Miss Vance's constant care, he might have died. The swelling around his spine could have paralyzed him. Her vigilance saved not just his life, but his future. Any impropriety is on us for making necessary mercy seem scandalous. Others began to stand and speak. Morrison talked about Colt's character, how he'd saved young Jimmy without thought for himself. Mrs. Chen spoke sharply about judging others when everyone had sins of their own to account for. Even Thomas Reddick, red-faced and stammering, managed to say that Rachel had shown more grace to him than he'd deserved. And the town owed her the same. But it was Agnes Bell who delivered the killing blow. The elderly woman rarely left her house these days, but she'd come tonight, leaning heavily on her nephew's arm. I've lived in this town for 40 years, she said, her voice carrying despite its thinness. I've seen good people driven away by gossip and small minds. I've seen marriages founder because folks spent more time minding other people's business than their own. And I've seen this town grow smaller and meaner with every person we've pushed out for being different. She paused, gathering strength. Rachel Vance spent days nursing a man she cares for, a good man who cares for her in return. If we punish that kind of love, what does that say about us? The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Patterson sat down. Her face flushed. Others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. I think, Reverend Pike said slowly, that we've strayed from Christian charity into something less noble. Perhaps we should return to the agenda. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Rachel sat frozen, overwhelmed by the unexpected support. She'd been prepared to be condemned, to perhaps even lose her place here. Instead, she'd found allies she hadn't known she had. As the meeting concluded, people approached her. Some mumbled apologies. Others simply nodded or touched her shoulder in passing. By the time the church emptied, Rachel found herself standing with Mrs. Hooper, Mrs. Chen, and Agnes Bell. Thank you, she managed. All of you. I didn't expect... Folks aren't all bad, Agnes said. Sometimes they just need reminding of what matters. You remind them, girl. Every time they see you refusing to shrink, refusing to apologize for who you are, you remind them that different doesn't mean wrong. She doesn't belong here, came a bitter voice. They turned to find Mrs. Patterson, clutching her shawl like armor. A woman like her will never truly fit in Dust Hollow. Maybe not, Rachel said quietly. But I'm staying anyway. This is my home now. Whether I fit or not, and I've got work to do. People who depend on me. And... She lifted her chin. Someone worth staying for. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Then she spun on her heel and marched away, her small group of supporters trailing behind. Well, Mrs. Hooper said with satisfaction, I'd say that went better than expected. The walk home was quiet, each woman lost in thought. At the boarding house, Rachel paused on the porch, looking out at the town spread below. Dust Hollow wasn't perfect. It probably never would fully accept her. But tonight, she'd seen something she hadn't expected: people willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. Are you coming in, Mrs.? Hooper asked. In a minute. Rachel stood there, breathing in the cold night air, thinking about belonging and acceptance and the difference between the two. She might never belong here the way others did, fitting neatly into expected roles. But she was accepted by the people who mattered. That had to be enough. A movement in the street caught her eye. Colt was making his way slowly up the hill, still favoring his injured side. She met him at the gate. Heard there was quite a meeting tonight, he said. News travels fast. Morrison told me, said Mrs. Hooper gave them all what for. He studied her face in the moonlight. You all right? Rachel considered the question. Yes, I think I am. It's strange, having people defend me. Good strange, but strange. Better get used to it, Colt said. Folks are starting to see what I've always seen, that you're worth defending. They stood close, the gate between them, but it felt like no barrier at all. Rachel could see the lingering pain in the way he held himself, the careful way he breathed. But he was here, alive, standing on his own feet. The relief of it still sometimes overwhelmed her. How are the ribs? She asked. Better every day. Doc says another week and I can start regular work again. He paused. Rachel, what you did for me was what anyone would do. No, he said firmly. It wasn't. You risked your reputation, your position here, everything, for me. I'll never forget that. Never stop being grateful. I don't want your gratitude, Rachel said softly. What do you want? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility. Rachel thought about all the things she wanted: acceptance, belonging, a place to truly call home. But looking at Colt, those grand desires condensed into something simpler. "I want you healthy," she said. "I want to stop being afraid of losing what little happiness I've found. I want—" She stopped, suddenly shy. "What?" he prompted gently. "I want to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, to stop expecting disaster, to maybe, just once, believe that good things can last." Colt reached through the gate, took her hand. His fingers were warm, calloused, familiar now from all those days of holding on while he fought through pain. "They can last," he said. "We can last, if we're brave enough to let it happen." "Are we brave enough?" "I am," he said simply. "Question is, are you—" Rachel thought about Mrs. Patterson's bitter face, about the whispers that would never fully die, about all the ways the world had told her she was too much or not enough. Then she thought about Agnes Bell's fierce defense, Mrs. Hooper's stalwart support, Mrs. Chen's quiet acceptance, about this man who saw her truly and didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, "I think I finally am." Colt smiled, that slow, warm smile that transformed his plain features. "Good, because as soon as I'm fully healed, I've got some proper courting to do. Going to do it right this time, in front of everyone." "Let them watch," Rachel said, surprising herself with the fierceness of it. "Let them all watch." He squeezed her hand once more, then headed back down the hill. Rachel watched him go, then turned to find Mrs. Hooper waiting in the doorway, smiling. "About time you stopped apologizing for existing," the older woman said. "I'm trying," Rachel admitted. "It's harder than I expected, changing the habits of a lifetime." "Most worthwhile things are hard," Mrs. Hooper said. "But you're doing it. Every day you hold that head up. Every time you refuse to shrink, you're doing it. And that boy there, he sees it. We all do." That night, Rachel lay in bed thinking about courage and community, about the unexpected places support could come from. The town meeting had shown her something important, that while there would always be those who wanted her to be less, there were also those who celebrated her as she was. She thought about Colt's promise to court her properly, publicly. Once, that would have terrified her. Now, she found herself looking forward to it. Let Mrs. Patterson clutch her pearls. Let the gossips whisper. She had work that mattered, people who cared about her, and a man who'd promised to court her in front of the whole town. "She doesn't belong here," Mrs. Patterson had said. Maybe not, Rachel thought, but I'm here anyway, and I'm not going anywhere. With that defiant thought, she turned to face the room toward the window where Colt's carved horse caught the moonlight, toward the door that led to a house full of people who'd become family, toward a future that suddenly seemed less impossible than it had just weeks ago. She belonged to herself, and for now, that was enough. True to his word. Colt began courting Rachel properly once Doc Miller declared him fully healed. It started with small things, walking her home from the laundry each evening, bringing her wildflowers picked from the meadow beyond the livery, sitting with her on the boarding house porch after supper while Mrs. Hooper pretended not to watch from the window. "You know the whole town's talking," Rachel said one evening as they sat together, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Let them talk," Colt replied easily. "Gives them something to do besides complain about the weather." But it was more than talk, and they both knew it. There were bets being placed at the saloon about when Colt would propose, if he'd propose, if Rachel would accept. Some said she was holding out for better options. Others said he was working up his courage. The truth, as usual, was simpler and more complex than any of the gossip. "I'm saving," Colt told her one evening, his voice serious. "Every penny I can. Morrison's given me a raise, and I'm taking extra work breaking horses for the ranches. I want to do this right. Rachel, want to offer you more than just my name." "I don't need," she began, but he pressed a finger gently to her lips. I know you don't need it, but I need to give it. Need to know I can provide for you proper, not rich, maybe, but stable, secure. He paused. There's a piece of land for sale, just outside town. Has a little cabin on it. Needs work, but the bones are good. I've been talking to the bank. Rachel's heart turned over. Colt. Just let me try, he said. Let me court you the way a man courts a woman he wants to marry. Let me prove to everyone, including myself, that I'm worthy of you. She wanted to protest that he'd already proven himself, 100 times over. But she saw the determination in his eyes, understood the pride behind it, so she nodded and let him continue his careful campaign. The whole town watched as spring arrived and their courtship deepened. Colt appeared at every social event with Rachel on his arm, danced every dance with her despite the height difference, stared down anyone who dared whisper. He was publicly, proudly, unabashedly courting the tall spinster from Iowa, and he didn't care who knew it. He's making a fool of himself. Mrs. Patterson sniffed one day, loud enough for Rachel to hear as she worked on the woman's hem. Perhaps, Rachel said calmly, not missing a stitch. But he's my fool, and I'll thank you not to speak ill of him in my presence. Mrs. Patterson colored but said nothing more. She needed this dress for the spring festival, and Rachel was still the best seamstress in town. The festival arrived with a burst of wildflowers and warming weather. The whole town turned out for the celebration dancing, games, food booths, and a general air of merriment that even the lingering winter couldn't dampen. Rachel had made herself a new dress for the occasion, soft green that brought out the gold in her hair. You look beautiful, Colt said when he came to collect her. He was dressed in his best, the blue shirt she'd made him, dark trousers, boots polished to a shine. So do you, she said, meaning it. They walked to the festival grounds together, heads high, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed. Let them look, Rachel thought. Let them see that she wasn't ashamed, wasn't hiding, wasn't apologizing for taking up space in their world. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Colt won her a carved wooden rose at the shooting gallery, his aim true despite his recent injury. They danced to the fiddle music, ate too much pie, laughed at the children's races. For a few hours, Rachel almost forgot she was different, almost felt like she truly belonged. Then, as the sun began to set and lanterns were being lit, Colt led her away from the crowds to a quieter spot near the old oak tree. Rachel's heart began to pound. There was something in his manner, a nervous energy that made her suspect. Rachel, he began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. I had a whole speech planned, practiced it for weeks, but standing here now, I can't remember a word of it. Then don't make a speech, she said softly. Just talk to me. He took her hands, his own trembling slightly. You know I'm not good with words, better with horses than people most days, but you make me want to be better. Not different, but better, the best version of myself. Colt. Wait, let me finish. I know I'm not much, a stable hand with rough hands and simple dreams, but I love you. Rachel Vance. Love your strength and your pride and the way you refuse to shrink for anyone. Love how you take up space in the world like you have every right to it because you do. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out something small wrapped in cloth. I've been working on this all winter. It's not much, but... He unwrapped it, revealing a ring. Not store-bought, but handmade, carved from the same pine as the little horse he'd given her, polished until it gleamed, with a small piece of turquoise Wyoming stone set into the band. I know it's not gold or silver, he said quickly, but I made it myself. Every night after work, thought you might like something no one else would have, something made just for you. Rachel stared at the ring, tears blurring her vision. It was perfect. Not because it was fancy or expensive, but because it was thoughtful, personal, made by his hands for hers. It's beautiful, she whispered, Rachel Eleanor Vance, Colt said, dropping to one knee right there in the grass, in full view of anyone who cared to look. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you're not too much of anything you're exactly right? She couldn't speak through the tears, so she nodded instead, holding out her hand. The ring fit perfectly, of course it did. He'd been mending clothes for months, had memorized her measurements without trying. When he stood and kissed her their first real kiss, there in front of God and Dust Hollow, a cheer went up from the festival. They turned to find half the town watching, with varying expressions of delight, shock, and in Mrs. Patterson's case, severe disapproval. "Is that a yes?" someone called out. "Yes," Rachel called back, finding her voice at last. "Yes, I'll marry him." More cheers, some applause, and not a few exchanges of money as bets were settled. Colt grinned and pulled her close. "Now they're really going to talk," he murmured. "Let them," Rachel said, echoing his earlier words. "We'll give them something worth talking about." The rest of the festival passed in a happy blur. People approached to offer congratulations, some genuine, some merely polite. But Rachel accepted them all with grace. Mrs. Hooper hugged her fiercely, whispering, "About damn time, Mrs." Chen smiled her rare smile and said, "Good man, good match, you'll be happy." Even Thomas Reddick approached, awkward but sincere. "I'm glad." He said simply, "You deserve someone who sees your worth. Colt's a lucky man." "Thank you," Rachel said, meaning it. "I hope you find happiness too." "Working on it," he admitted. "Been writing to a widow in Cheyenne. She's nothing like my Mary," thinking that might be a good thing. As the festival wound down and they walked home, Rachel kept looking at the ring on her finger, marveling at the reality of it. Engaged, to be married, to have a home, a husband, a future she'd stopped believing was possible. "When?" she asked as they reached the boarding house. "Whenever you want," Colt said. "Tomorrow, if you like. Or we can wait. Plan something proper." June, Rachel decided. After the spring rush of mending is done. A small wedding, just the people who matter. "June it is." He kissed her again, soft and sweet. "I love you, Rachel, all of you, every inch." She laughed, the sound bright in the evening air. "Even the extra inches." "Especially those," he said firmly. "Means there's more of you to love." That night, Rachel sat in her room, turning the wooden ring on her finger, watching how the turquoise caught the lamplight. On her windowsill, the carved horse seemed to prance with shared joy. She thought about writing to her sisters in Iowa, telling them the news. They'd be shocked their too-tall spinster sister, finally married at 34. But first, she had something else to do. She pulled out paper and pen and began to write. "Wedding dress for Rachel Vance. Measurements as follows." She smiled as she wrote, imagining the dress she'd make for herself. Nothing fancy, she wasn't a fancy person, but something beautiful, something that fit her perfectly, something that announced to the world that she was done apologizing for who she was. A knock at the door interrupted. "Come in," she called. Mrs. Hooper entered, carrying tea and a knowing smile. "Thought you might be too excited to sleep." "You thought right." Rachel accepted the tea gratefully. "I can't quite believe it's real." "It's real, all right. That boy's been carving that ring since December. Morrison told me he'd stay up half the night working on it, wanting it perfect." She settled into the chair by the window. "You know there'll be talk, more than ever now." "I know." Rachel twisted the ring, feeling the smooth wood warm under her fingers. "But I find I don't care as much as I used to. Is that wrong?" "That's growth," Mrs. Hooper said firmly. "You can't live your life trying to please people who are determined to disapprove. You've got a good man who loves you, work you're proud of, and friends who'll stand by you. That's more than most get in this life. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sipping tea and listening to the night sounds of the town. Somewhere in the distance, music still played from the festival. Closer by, she could hear voices and laughter as people made their way home. "Thank you," Rachel said suddenly, "for taking me in that first night, for pushing me to stay, for everything." "No thanks needed. You've more than paid your way with rent and mending. Besides, Mrs. Hooper's eyes twinkled. "I've gotten used to having you around. Be strange when you move out." "Not until June, and even then, I'll still be working at the laundry. You won't be rid of me that easily." "Good. This old place would be too quiet without you." After Mrs. Hooper left, Rachel prepared for bed, but sleep eluded her. She kept thinking about the future, the wedding, the cabin Colt had mentioned, the life they'd build together. It wouldn't be grand or fancy. She wouldn't have her shop back or the status she'd once dreamed of. But she'd have something better, a partner who saw her truly, who celebrated rather than tolerated who she was. She thought about the young woman who'd stepped off that train months ago, full of hope and fear in equal measure. That woman had been prepared for disappointment, had half expected it. She never could have imagined this, not just love, but acceptance. Not just a husband, but a home. "I'm getting married," she whispered to the darkness, trying out the words. They felt foreign on her tongue, but right in her heart. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Plans to make, a dress to sew, a life to prepare for. There would be challenges, there always were. Some people would never accept them. Some would always see her as too much and him as not enough. But tonight, with a wooden ring on her finger and joy in her heart, Rachel Vance allowed herself to believe in happiness, to trust that sometimes, against all odds, love could bloom in the most unlikely places, even in a dusty Wyoming town, even for a too-tall seamstress and a gentle horseman, even for two people who'd learned to expect less from life than it had finally decided to give them. The stitch that held, she thought, remembering Colt's words from months ago. They'd sewn something together, carefully, one day at a time, and now it was strong enough to last. She fell asleep, smiling, facing the room and the future with equal courage. The June wedding dawned clear and bright, with wildflowers blooming across the Wyoming hills like nature's own celebration. Rachel stood before the mirror in her room at the boarding house her last morning in this space that had become home, wearing the dress she'd sewn with her own hands. Simple ivory cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It fit her tall frame perfectly, making no attempt to disguise or diminish her height. "You look like yourself," Mrs. Hooper said from the doorway, and it was the highest compliment she could have given. Beautiful and strong and exactly right. "I feel like myself," Rachel admitted, smoothing the skirt. "For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be anything else." The ceremony was held in the meadow behind the church, under the same oak tree where Colt had proposed. It was a small gathering, just the people who mattered. Mrs. Hooper stood as her witness, tears streaming down her usually stern face. Morrison was Colt's best man, beaming like a proud father. Mrs. Chen, Agnes Bell, Doc Miller, the Morrisons, even Thomas Reddick with his new bride from Cheyenne, all the people who'd become family when Rachel had none of her own to invite. When Reverend Pike asked if anyone objected, there was a moment of held breath. Everyone knew Mrs. Patterson and her circle were notably absent, having declared they wouldn't sanction such an unnatural union. But the meadow remained peaceful, filled only with birdsong and the whisper of wind through grass. "Do you, Rachel Eleanor Vance, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Rachel said, her voice clear and strong. "Do you, Colt James Harland, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Colt replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "With my whole heart." When they kissed as husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Someone had brought fiddles, and soon music filled the meadow. They danced on the grass. Rachel in her wedding dress and Colt in his Sunday best, neither caring that they looked mismatched in height or that people passing on the road stopped to stare. "No regrets?" Colt asked as they swayed together. "Only one," Rachel said, "that it took me so long to stop running from this." The celebration continued into the afternoon, but eventually, Colt led Rachel to a waiting wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers. Their friends threw rice and called out good wishes as they drove away, heading not for some distant honeymoon destination, but for the small cabin on the edge of town that would be their home. Colt had spent weeks preparing it, with help from Morrison and the other men. The roof was newly patched, the walls freshly whitewashed, the windows cleaned until they sparkled. It wasn't grand, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harland," Colt said, lifting her down from the wagon. "Home," Rachel repeated, tasting the word. It had been so long since she'd had one. That first night in their own place, as they lay together in the bed Colt had built with his own hands, Rachel found herself crying not from sadness, but from a joy so profound it couldn't be contained any other way. "What's wrong?" Colt asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing," she assured him, wiping her tears. "Everything's right. That's why I'm crying. I spent so many years facing the wall, turning away from life because I was afraid of being hurt, and now—" "Now," he prompted gently. "Now I can't imagine sleeping any way but facing you." He pulled her close, this man who'd seen her at her tallest and lowest, who'd carved her a ring from pine because he wanted her to have something unique, who'd stood up to a whole town's prejudice for the right to love her openly. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Every inch of you. Even the extra inches." It had become their private joke, but there was always a thread of real question in it. "Especially those," he said firmly, as he always did, "means there's more of you to love." The months that followed were not without challenges. Some in the town never fully accepted them, crossing the street rather than offer congratulations, whispering behind their hands when Rachel walked by. But for every cold shoulder, there were 2 warm smiles. Her business at the laundry continued to thrive, even Mrs. Patterson eventually returned, unable to find anyone else who could match Rachel's skill with a needle. By the time the first snow fell, Rachel was pregnant. The news traveled through Dust Hollow at its usual lightning speed, bringing a fresh wave of speculation. Would the baby be as tall as its mother? How would poor Colt manage? What kind of life could such a child expect? "Let them wonder," Rachel said one evening, her hand on her growing belly. "Our child will be loved and wanted. That's more than many can say." "Our child will be perfect," Colt agreed. "Whether they're tall or short or somewhere in between." The baby came with the spring thaw, a daughter with her mother's auburn hair and her father's hazel eyes. They named her Grace, and she was indeed perfect, though the town busybodies were disappointed when she showed every sign of being average height. "Maybe the next one will be tall," Mrs. Patterson said with false sympathy when she brought a christening gown to be mended. "Maybe," Rachel agreed pleasantly. "Or maybe they'll be short, or maybe they'll be exactly who they're meant to be, and we'll love them regardless." Years passed. More children came William, who would indeed grow tall like his mother, and little Margaret, who took after Colt. The cabin expanded as their family grew, rooms added with the help of neighbors who'd become friends. Rachel continued her work at the laundry, eventually taking it over when Mrs. Chen's eyes finally failed completely. She hired other women who needed work, creating a place where skill mattered more than appearance or reputation. Colt prospered too, eventually becoming part owner of the livery when Morrison retired. He was known throughout the territory as the man who could gentle any horse, who treated animals and people with equal kindness. Together, they built a life that was neither grand nor remarkable to outsiders, but was filled with the quiet contentment of 2 people who'd found their match in unexpected ways. On their 10th anniversary, Colt presented Rachel with a new ring, this one silver, bought with money carefully saved. You don't need to replace the wooden one, Rachel protested. I love it. Not replacing, Colt said, slipping the silver band on alongside the carved pine. Just adding to, like our life started simple, grew into something more. That night, as they lay in bed with moonlight streaming through windows now curtained with lace Rachel had sewn herself, she thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train so many years ago. That woman had been prepared for disappointment, had slept facing the wall to protect herself from hurt. This woman wife, mother, successful business owner, respected member of the community despite lingering whispers, slept facing her husband, their children down the hall. Their life spread around them like a quilt made of ordinary days stitched together with love. What are you thinking about? Colt asked, sensing her wakefulness. About how I used to sleep facing the wall, Rachel said. About how you told me not to turn away anymore. Best advice I ever gave, he said, pulling her closer. Though I was being presumptuous, we barely knew each other then. You knew me, Rachel corrected. Somehow, you always knew me. Just like you knew me, saw past the stable hand to something more. We saw each other, Rachel said simply. That's all. We just saw each other truly. Outside, an owl called, and one of the children stirred in their sleep. Tomorrow would bring its usual challenges: clothes to mend, horses to tend, children to raise, gossips to ignore or confront as needed. But tonight, in this bed they'd shared for 10 years, in this house they'd built together, Rachel Harland felt the deep contentment of a life well lived. She'd come to Dust Hollow looking for a husband and found so much more. Found work that mattered, friends who stood by her, a community that had learned slowly, grudgingly in some cases, to make room for someone different. Most of all, she'd found herself. Not the shortened, diminished version she'd tried to be for so many years, but her full self, taking up all the space she was meant to. I love you, she told Colt, as she did every night. Love you too, he replied, as he always did. Every inch of you. Rachel smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow their eldest would start school, facing her own challenges as the daughter of the town's tallest woman and the stable hand who'd dared to court her. But Rachel had faith. Her children were growing up in a house where differences were celebrated, where love was louder than whispers, where no one ever had to sleep facing the wall. She'd broken the pattern, refused the narrative that said she was too much. In doing so, she'd made room for her daughters and son to be exactly who they were. No apologies needed. That, more than any success or acceptance, was her greatest achievement. As sleep finally claimed her, Rachel's last thought was of that scared, proud woman at the train station, clutching her trunk and her dignity with equal desperation. It gets better, she wanted to tell her. Not easier, always, but better. You'll find your place. You'll find your people. You'll find yourself. And in finding herself, she'd found everything else: love, family, home, and the courage to face it all with her eyes wide open, never again turning to the wall. The stars wheeled overhead. The children slept peacefully, and in a small cabin on the edge of Dust Hollow, Wyoming, Rachel Harland rested in the arms of a man who'd taught her that she didn't need to be anything more or less than exactly what she was enough. She didn't sleep facing the wall anymore. She never would again. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, acceptance, and finding where you belong. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed Rachel and Colt's journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who might need to hear that they, too, are exactly enough just as they are. Until next time, partners.